iSelect Fund is not soliciting investment or providing investment advice in any way whatsoever. This presentation is general industry research based on publicly available information. iSelect is a venture capital firm in St. Louis focused on companies in food, agriculture, and health. iSelect invests at the forefront of innovation, seeking emerging problems, solutions, and technologies. iSelect uses these deep dive presentations not only as a way to better engage with and understand new science and technology, but also engage with the experts and entrepreneurs who drive and change innovation in their respective fields.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to iSelect's Deep Dive webinar series. My name is David Yoakum. I'm a principal here on iSelect's investment team, and I'm excited to welcome you to our discussion today. One theme that we've been researching is climate smart agriculture, and specifically carbon measurement, reporting, and verification, MRV, in agriculture. In recent years, agriculture's role in the production of greenhouse gases, principally nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide, which today we will discuss largely as carbon dioxide equivalent, has come under significant attention as a part of the global climate challenge. However, in the same token, greater attention is being paid to the agricultural methods and solutions that not only can significantly reduce emissions, but in fact sequester them, principally in biological sources. For agricultural practice changes to occur, we do need systems that create both incentives and trust for farmers, purchasers of their products, and purchasers of the carbon credits derived from their work and their efforts. Measurement, reporting, and verification protocols are central to making this all come together. To kick things off today, we're going to start off with some introductions from our speakers, then we're going to move into some sort of core trends that are helping define why we're having the conversation that we're having today. Then we're going to speak about some key issues, both in the implementation of carbon projects, technologies that are being deployed, the way that those look across rangeland versus cropland, and then how farmers are playing a role in this and some of the opportunities they face, as well as some of the challenges. So with that, I'd love if we could start off with some introductions. So we could start off with Debbie, then go with Lars, Kevin, and Mitchell. That'd be fantastic.
Thanks, David. I'm Debbie Reed, the Executive Director of the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium and the Ecosystem Service Market Research Consortium, our research arm. And we're a nonprofit working and operating the first national market program for supply chain accounting and reporting for companies with agriculture in their supply chain.
Awesome. Thank you, Debbie. Lars?
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Lars Dyrud. I'm the CEO of EarthOptics. EarthOptics is a soil mapping company with an emphasis on mapping. So we deploy technologies like proximal sensors and satellite data to dramatically increase the power of a traditional soil sample, allowing us to take far fewer soil samples for mapping just about anything you want, including carbon. So we've been thrilled to be participating in carbon measurement across grass and rangeland and row crop projects now for nearly 2 years.
Awesome. Thanks, Lars. Kevin?
Morning, everybody. So I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Product Manager at Vence, helping set up our insetting and offsetting programs. Vence is a virtual fencing technology company that uses stimuli to help do rotational grazing at scale without the need for physical fencing and really unlocking those possibilities. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. And last but not least, Mitch.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Mitchell Hora. I'm a 7th generation farmer from Southeast Iowa. My family farm is mostly corn, soybeans, but we've been deep into this space for a long time, started no-tilling in 1978 and using cover crops in 2013. So really seeing these things and a big believer. I started Continuum Ag, and we've now expanded that company, really helping farmers with the how-to of regen ag. So we've built the topsoil tool to help farmers manage and track their soil health data, integrated in technologies like are represented here today, and helping farmers to successfully implement regenerative ag systems. And then as a bonus outcome of successfully implementing regen ag, hopefully there's a bunch of carbon sequestration and lower carbon intensity of our crops that we're producing. Excited to dig further into that here today.
Awesome. Well, thanks to all our speakers. We're really excited to hear all your perspectives in sort of putting this panel together. We wanted to make sure we got a diverse set of perspectives from anybody from implementing carbon programs to participating in them to building the technologies and the solutions that help enable the future that these programs are promising. And so really excited to hear everybody's perspectives. Just to jump in, I'm going to spend a few minutes here just sort of setting the stage for the remainder of the discussion, bring us up to speed on some definitions, some recent trends, and sort of how to sort of think about how carbon MRV is being implemented in agriculture and why that matters. So for anybody who might be new to even agriculture as an industry, in the past 5 to 10 years in particular, though estimates vary, agriculture has represented a significant contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. These are on the left statistics around the US GHG emissions. And initially, I just want to create a distinction here when we talk about carbon in terms of GHGs. They'll sort of be used interchangeably today, but functionally, we're talking about carbon dioxide equivalent because a lot of these emissions aren't specifically carbon dioxide. They're in the form of nitrous oxide and methane in particular. But needless to say, the EPA estimates that the US emissions, approximately 11% came from agriculture, and the leading sources being from enteric fermentation, manure management, and from cropland soils. And so this has become a significant area of focus and criticism for the industry, but also an opportunity to say, where are ways in which we can get better? And also agriculture as a biological system, how can it serve as part of the solution going forward, as opposed to being seen as part of the problem? And so that's where thinking about agriculture as a carbon sink comes in. In fact, global soils have about 3.1 times the carbon storage capacity of the atmosphere, which is dwarfed only by the storage capacity of the ocean. And biologically, we're typically discussing the opportunity to create soil and crop systems that are functionally less disturbed and more capable of storing soil organic carbon at higher rates for longer periods of time at a greater rate than they're released back into the atmosphere. And so this serves largely as a function of the relationship that soil organic matter has with permanent root systems to store significant carbon quantities over the course of time. I'd be remiss not to mention that obviously, inorganic carbon plays a role in terms of storage in soil, and there are companies that are working on technologies such as enhanced weathering as a way of reintroducing minerals to soil to sequester carbon in a much longer format. Eventually, it would end up in the ocean, but as a agronomic input. But just putting these two slides in context, the main takeaway is to say agriculture today has a significant contributor to GHG emissions, but in the same token, is a part of a biological system that, when treated correctly and when processed correctly, has an opportunity to also store carbon in a significant way, as well as reducing emissions from the current practices that we take on currently. So you might be wondering what some of those practices look like and what those things are that we can do. So at the simplest level, there's really two things the industry can do in terms of building a climate-friendly and resilient food system. One is reduce emissions in food production, and the other is sequester emissions via food production. So how can agriculture help do both of these things? Well, there's a number of agricultural practices which, under the recent branding, which the USDA would call climate smart, other circles might call this regenerative, others might call this sustainable, but tools like agroforestry, cover cropping, and no-till practices can help improve carbon stocks in soil and in plants while reducing soil disturbance that would release carbon back into the atmosphere. Tools like biochar can be used as an extremely beneficial soil amendment that has a very long carbon permanence in the soil, meaning that it doesn't break down and release into the atmosphere rapidly. Rotational grazing can help improve the productivity of grassland ecosystems and their ability to store soil organic carbon, and the list goes on with a number of others who are here. Unfortunately, for many developers and adopters of these technologies, the USDA, as you can see on the bottom right here, recently announced 70 projects will be the recipient of $2.8 billion for the adoption, implementation, and incentivization of climate smart agricultural practices. So we're kind of at the beachhead of this really exciting opportunity to take a lot of these tools that, I mean, I think Mitch will speak to this a little bit later, but tools that have been used for a long time. But we're at this time now where there's a momentum around this challenge, particularly this GHG emissions challenge, in addition to some of the maturity in terms of the ways in which we can measure and manage some of these efforts in order to help deliver value both to farmers, but also societal benefit in terms of the reduction of GHG emissions and also producing a more resilient food system overall. I'm going to pause here to see if there's any comments from the speakers at this point before I jump into the next slide. in case I missed anything. All right. So before we move into sort of talking more about carbon markets, carbon credits, carbon programs that farmers might be participating in, there are some core concepts that are really important to understand in terms of, how we functionally make all these things work together. And so, Debbie, before we move into some of the work more specifically around what you guys are doing with ESMC, I think it would be really awesome if you could help the audience understand some of the nuances in terms of how carbon gets offsetted or insetted in a supply chain, and maybe creating a distinction between what an offset is, an inset is, and what you would describe as a scope 3 supply chain intervention. Can you speak to some of those three and sort of why they matter?
Yep, sure. Thanks for that. So I'll start maybe with the middle, right? With scope 1 through 3 emissions. For any country or any company that has to do a greenhouse gas inventory, they have to look at their direct emissions and what they are. That's scope 1. Their indirect coming from energy, that's scope 2. And then their indirect from their supply chain, which is scope 3. And that will help elucidate offsets, insets, and then supply chain emission reduction. So starting with the offsets, and I've been working in this industry since the offset market started in the 90s. Offsets are a different beast, and they are a way to create emission reductions more cheaply than a company can do within their own walls. Carbon offsets are different from insets and different from supply chain emissions several ways. Jurisdictionally, number one, they can come from anywhere. An offset that a company purchases in the United States can come from China, for instance, or anywhere in the United States, anywhere in the world. 2, sectorally, they can cross boundaries. So a oil and gas company or Microsoft can buy an offset from a different sector, for instance, the agricultural sector. Number 3, offsets create an emission reduction, but they also allow emissions to increase elsewhere. So they do not ever get you to net zero. At best, they just keep you level. So that's the definition of an offset. They can only be utilized to account for changes in the company's scope 1 emissions. They can't be utilized in scope 2 or scope 3. Insets. The definition of an inset is an offset that occurs within a company's supply chain. So it's an offset, meaning it still allows an emission to increase elsewhere. It can cross jurisdictional boundaries, but it has to be within the supply chain of an organization. So it doesn't cross sectoral boundaries. A supply chain emission reduction or emission factor or impact unit is different because it is not an offset. It is an absolute increase in soil carbon or absolute reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It does not allow an emission to occur elsewhere. So that is a huge difference between the first two. And it does not cross jurisdictional or sectoral boundaries. So supply chain emission reductions have to occur where a company actually sources a commodity, and they have to be within their supply chain. So for a food and beverage sector, it has to occur within an agricultural supply chain, for instance, or somewhere else they source products. So, but there are 3 different market mechanisms with 3 different market opportunities and ways of being quantified, monitored, and verified.
Right. Thank you. Well, Debbie, that was a really, obviously you've spoken a lot about this over the last however many years. In terms of just going back to one point you made around the offsets versus the insets, I mean, it sounds like, and from what I've read and what you've described here, is that the insets and the supply chain interventions are really a much clearer path in terms of getting to an actual net zero goal, as opposed to the offset programs, which right, you mentioned are cheaper, but perhaps not quite as effective as actually getting to the goal that we're looking at here.
I think that's exactly right. Insets, so we started an organization, our market program, with the intent of creating offsets and insets, and our companies, the buyer said, we don't need offsets, we don't need insets, we need supply chain emission reductions. Because if you're following SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, or you have a commitment that's SBTI, you cannot use offsets or insets until you have achieved net neutrality in your carbon, in your emissions profile, and then you can use offsets.
Awesome.
Right? So they cannot use them typically for the first 20 or 30 years.
Yep. Kevin, I saw you nodding. I don't know if you wanted to add anything. I saw you.
Yeah, no, that was probably the most cogent explanation of the different levels that I've ever heard. So I was just in rapid agreement.
Awesome. Thanks, Debbie. The one last just definition that I would want to throw in the mix here, just particularly since we're talking about agricultural systems that are functionally biological systems, is this concept of permanence, and thinking about how long emissions last for in terms of how they're sequestered, how long they're sequestered for, which also comes into nuance of the types of emissions that are either prevented or offset in some way. I think we'll have a little bit more of an in-depth discussion around that, but it's a core consideration in terms of thinking about what the long-term impacts of these types of offsets or insets could be. So moving into sort of the core definition around some of the conversation that we're already having, and that speaks to sort of the title of this this deep dive, is it really in order to accomplish all of this, which is to really say we want to build a food system that is regenerative, that is climate positive, that is also climate resilient. We need to know that the work that is being done is in fact being done and that it's working. And so that's where an effective measurement, reporting, and verification program comes in. Just to give the definition for anybody who may be new to this concept, measurement, reporting, and verification refers to the multi-step process to measure the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are reduced by a specific mitigation activity, so such as reducing emissions from deforestation or forest degradation over a period of time, and to report these findings to an accredited third party. And so we'll explore more what that actually looks like in a program, who the real stakeholders are there. But this third party then verifies the report so that the results can be certified into carbon credits, which then end up being used to pay people who have done the good work to improve either the sequestration of a project or reduce the emissions inherent to a project. And so with that in mind, the sort of goals of an MRV program are really to understand sort of where we are today, create incentives for the production and purchase of high quality carbon credits, and then build trust in a system that all stakeholders believe the system is in fact working. And that can be the power of a well put together MRV program and system. So with that in mind, MRV sort of comes to life through some of these carbon programs in marketplaces, such as those implemented by Debbie and her team at ESMC. So Debbie, I'm wondering if you can just give us a little bit more context for what ESMC does and how your carbon programs work, and really who, I've been doing some background research, understanding all the key stakeholders that are involved in this decision-making process to make this whole thing work. How do they all sort of come together for somebody who may not have any exposure to this type of marketplace or this type of program?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we are different. We are very unique in that we are nonprofit and we are a public-private partnership and a member-based organization. So our members, we have 80 members across the ag supply chain and value chain that represent buyers, so corporations across the ag supply chain who have taken on commitments and need to account for their emission reductions. We have technology companies, measurement quantification companies. We have agricultural groups and individual producers that participate, and land-grant universities, soil scientists, researchers, etc. Right? So we all collaborated in building our program and our platform to meet the needs of companies who have taken on commitments to reduce their, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but we also generate water quality, water quantity, and starting to generate biodiversity goals because companies are taking on commitments to do so. How we operate is we take on, ESMC has built like an MRV platform that is all digitized so that our entire process, we're finalizing this now, is digitized from start to end. And we take on the role of developing the protocols and getting them validated. We work with partners who actually do producer outreach, technical advice for practice changes, and then enroll partners. We have partners we work with, such as EarthOptics, that do soil sampling for us to meet our program needs. And then we work on internally the quantification of the credits. The credits are verified with Sustained Cert and Gold Standard, who are global certification and verification bodies. Then we sell to buyers and pay producers. How we have set up that system is probably different and unique as well. But the point is that it's really a collective enabling environment, because what we observed is that individual companies who have to do accounting and reporting in scope 3, if they needed to do it themselves and invest in all the tools and technologies, would be a waste of resources, number one. Number two, it would take us all a lot longer to develop that.
Right.
And we would not be able to scale the outcomes in the timeframes that we need to actually achieve what we need to achieve.
Gotcha. And that's, I mean, there's so much in there. I think one of the things that on the surface, when you read through sort of how these different types of programs are structured, and for anybody who's curious to actually read a side-by-side comparison of a lot of the different programs that are available, that's source 2 in this PDF that'll be distributed following this conversation today, has a really helpful breakdown of a lot of those different types of programs. So I think when you look at sort of the flow chart, it makes sense, right? The farmers taking on new practices, you're helping sort of coordinate, galvanize this effort around those who are verifying, partners like EarthOptics who are helping to measure, the registries who are helping sort of basically list out the credits that are being exchanged. Can you explain a little bit about the two that I always find the most hazy in terms of understanding from like a layman's perspective are the verifiers and the registries? Like how would you explain what those two parties do in terms of this whole system?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way carbon offset and inset markets work is a little bit different from how we work. So I'll explain it from that perspective, right? So the way our program, and we just received validation and verification by Sustained Cert and Gold Standard in August. What that means is they validated our program. That is equivalent to having your protocol approved in an offset market, right?
Right.
But they looked at our entire program and how we carry it out to ensure that we're quantifying appropriately, we're collecting data and tracking it appropriately, we're monitoring appropriately before we even get to the verification process, right? So Sustained Cert is a certification body that certifies that our accounting, our reporting, our data collection, quantification meets all of the rigor, levels of certainty and uncertainty required for companies to then say, yes, this is a valid report claim that I can make to show that interventions a company is taking within their supply chain are accurate and are credibly reported. So it's a little bit different than an offset registry. The other thing is that the reason we work with Sustained Cert and Gold Standard is that they work on not only scope 3 supply chain reporting for different sectors, but they also track impacts and quantification for companies to help meet their commitments toward the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2030, right? Mm-hmm. So it accounts for land use, water use, impacts, labor, lots of different things. So that is a benefit to our program, right? So we're doing the accounting and the reporting for companies in their supply chain reporting to meet their SBTI commitments, et cetera, but also helping them to quantify what they're doing to meet UND Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. In terms of a registry, it doesn't work quite the same either, right? So Sustained Cert validated our program, and then they verify every project. And we have created a digital platform to help them come in, look at all our data, how it is stored, how we do QA, QC. And then at the end of that, they will verify that, yes, our claims are materially accurate and verified, and that they meet levels of uncertainty. In the Sustained Cert program that we are in, they have two different programs.
Yeah.
Our level of accuracy allows multiple companies to actually share the emission factors generated from our program. That means we've met enough level of accuracy that they don't think we're propagating error across the system.
Right.
So if, for instance, we're working with General Mills and generating scope 3 emission factors for wheat, If they in fact work with Cargill or ADM on the wheat, right, and they get it from them, they can all share that emission factor across their supply chain, whoever actually builds or buys and sells that product. It could be ADM, General Mills, and possibly even McDonald's, for instance.
Right.
They can share the emission factors. Some people think it's double counting. It's not. It is actually different in scope 3. So SustainCert has a program, a software platform that will actually track that across the supply chain. And we have partnered with them to allow two things: to allow different buyers to co-invest, so that reduces how much each buyer pays for that. And then we create ongoing dividends to producers. So each time a emission factor for a commodity is resold in that supply chain, the producer gets an additional dividend for it. That is basically how it's different. It's not like secondary or tertiary markets that operate in the offset sector, but it is probably analogous.
Yeah, that's a really helpful comparison. I guess the one thing I would think might be helpful from a clarity perspective that I still find is sometimes kind of hard to understand unless you talk to experts in the space is like, in terms of the actual, can you give it a concrete example of a verification that would occur, or a way in which a practice or a project would in fact be verified, and sort of how that works briefly?
Yeah, so if you look at the screenshot on the left, if you will. So once we have done everything, the producer's enrolled, they've undertaken a practice change, they've included all of the data in our MRV platform, if you will. It is all tracked and captured in our platform. We then send the data to be modeled, whether it's to a carbon modeler and greenhouse gas modeler, or to the water modeler, or both. In many instances, that comes back. We then submit that package of data to SustainCert for verification. What they will do is they literally have electronic lines of sight into the MRV platform to look at our QA, our QC processes. Is the data we said this is based on in that platform? If necessary, if there's anything missing, they can flag it for us. If they want to call a producer and find out, did you do this practice, right? They can do that. But it is intended to be digitized and much more less burdensome, if you will, than those verification processes in the past. So they look at everything they need to ensure that the process we said we were following is a process we followed. All of the data is there to show the accuracy of the claims that we can then sell.
Super helpful. Thank you, Debbie. So hopefully this gives everybody some context for all the stakeholders that are involved in these programs. Obviously, some of the nuance of the ESMC program itself, but in terms of how we get from a farmer taking on a practice change to a functional credit of some kind in the form of an offset, an inset, or a scope 3 supply chain intervention. Obviously, within the scope of MRV, one of the important components is measurement. And the measurement field has evolved a lot in the last 5 to 6 years. Ever since I've been on the iSelect team, there's been a constant evolution in terms of the tools that are available for doing measurement. And we're having worked closely with EarthOptics. When I'm discussing with investors sort of how this breaks down in terms of how we measure carbon in agriculture, I break it down into sort of 3 buckets to try and make it as simple as possible. There's obviously nuance within this, so I don't want to oversimplify this, but I find it as a helpful way to think about it. There is direct sampling, i.e. we take a soil sample, we verify components about that through dry combustion or other technologies to verify attributes of that soil. We have remote sensing from really far away, like a satellite image. It tells us where we can basically use machine learning to understand attributes about soil at sort of the surface level based off of satellite imagery or from hyperspectral imagery. And then we have remote sensing that gives us a much closer look at what's happening at the soil. And that's either via technologies that are able to penetrate the earth and capture information below the surface, or tools like, for example, like a yardstick who uses spectroscopy in terms of capturing information below the surface in a sample point to reduce the number of soil samples that need to be taken. But overall, there's two goals. We want to measure with great accuracy, and we want to measure with low cost, high efficiency, and a high level of automation, so that the amount of work that's going into capturing this information is as minimized as much as possible and is democratized as much as possible. So now is a great time to sort of bring Lars into the conversation. Lars, can you give us a little bit of context for what you guys are doing at EarthOptics and sort of the problem you guys solve in terms of measuring carbon stocks in agriculture? And the only other thing I would add on to that is EarthOptics does a certain level of data capture, but you guys combine with data from a lot of other sources, including all the data sources that are listed here on this chart today. So maybe just tell us a little bit about, again, just what you guys are doing and how it ties into the other technologies that are currently being deployed to understand carbon in agriculture.
No, David, thank you so much. That's that's a great setup. So at EarthOptics, we're kind of focused on how do we solve the very general problem of being able to quantify both baseline soil carbon, but also changes in soil carbon. And just to put in perspective what a challenging problem this is in general and why it's been such a costly and kind of sticking point for a lot of these programs is if you take an acre foot of soil, it weighs in general about 2,000 tons, right? And typical soil carbon concentrations in the soil for a Midwestern farm could vary from say 2 to 5%, where 5 is probably historically high. It might have been, natural prairie level soil carbon concentration. Many farms these days are somewhere between, 1 and 3. With the practice changes we've been talking about and referring to in terms of cover cropping or low till or no till or even rotational grazing or adding in prescribed burns and things like that for ranches, you're typically in general rule of thumb going to be looking to get a 1 ton, maybe in the most best case scenario, 2 ton CO2 equivalent per year increase in the soil carbon, mostly in that top 1 foot of soil. Remember I said CO2 equivalent, which is about a third of a ton. So let's get back to that 2,000 ton acre foot of soil. So even over a 10-year period, if you're looking to go after maybe 10, 20 tons of CO2 increase over a 10-year period, you're still representing about a 1 part in 1,000 change of carbon concentration inside that 2,000 ton acre foot of soil. This is a very small amount, right? So in order to actually quantify that change, you need to take historically a lot of soil samples. And I'm in general the type of projects that Debbie works with and that we make measurements for. If you wanted to truly quantify that change accurately and confidently, you'd be taking many, many samples per acre. Well, that would be so ridiculously expensive. In general, it costs about $15 to $20 just to collect a soil sample and have it tested in a laboratory for usually through dry combustion to determine the amount of carbon in it. And so that would be about 5 times more value or cost than the value of the carbon you're accumulating in the soil today anyway. So it's not economical. That's not what's happened. So folks have been looking for combining practice-based models and other ways of combining measurement with models to still get a good estimate of and good verification whether soil carbon is increasing or not. And what we really wanted to do is, hey, how can we set the bar for accuracy still incredibly high, trying to actually directly detect a change in soil carbon on 5-year type of basis, but get the cost down so it's economical. And so we focus on technology development. David alluded to it. We basically use everything that you've listed here in order to achieve that goal. And so we're using in situ sensors like Crystal Labs to reduce the number of samples we need to send to a lab. We use ground penetrating radar and electromagnetic induction. We've just added gamma ray detection. We're testing on a number of our rigs this fall. And we also combine it with high resolution LiDAR-based elevation data sets and hydrologic modeling and satellite data as well. And so the whole goal in the fairly practical approach we've taken is how do we not eliminate the sample? That is the gold standard for how you directly try to quantify changes in soil carbon, but how can we dramatically reduce the number of those samples you need, particularly on a per acre basis, to achieve that truly important goal of being able to quantify carbon changes in the soil on annual or multi-annual timescales. So it's a challenging problem. It's one we think we're really excited that we've made a lot of progress on. But it really is, I think, a key piece in the success of all these programs, because without the believability and that quantified nature of change in soil carbon, we really think it's going to be an uphill battle to get some of these programs to really take hold within a larger portion of the public and companies that want to participate with them. There's a lot of ways to sequester carbon. We think soil is one of the most important, but it'll kind of always remain that, that that kind of what is it, the ugly stepchild, until we can really demonstrate strongly that we measure these changes are real. So yeah, I think that's a kind of quick background on what we do and how it relates to this ecosystem.
Thanks, Lars. Debbie, I don't know if you have a perspective here, but given the amount of experience you have in the field and some of just the way in which all these really powerful data sets are starting to come together, how has that made these types of programs easier to implement, like lower cost to implement, less cumbersome for people to be participating in? What role does just improving the overall measurement process and doing the kind of work that Lars and their team are doing do to sort of change the paradigm of how people might participate in a program like this, or how effective it might be?
Yeah, so it's incredibly important that there are organizations who understand the power of technology and ground truthing those technologies everywhere that they are actually operating and utilizing the technology. And so when we started, right, 4 years ago doing soil sampling, we were doing 60 centimeter, 3-inch getting soil carbon probes, right, at a high density, and it's incredibly expensive. It's not sustainable, but that's what we had, right? So we are really excited to see groups like EarthOptics doing the due diligence, understanding the variability and how you account for that variability in a way that will actually meet the validation and verification requirements of a market-based program, right? So to me, it's incredibly exciting. And that is one of the reasons we're working with EarthOptics, right? We cannot sustain the level of cost in soil sampling that we've seen in the past. And I'll add one more thing. The highest risk to our entire program, getting projects started and finished to date, remains soil sampling. There are human errors, there are technology errors, there's the need to get the data in a timely fashion, on time, get it into the hands of the modelers, et cetera. So technologies that will make it more accurate and reduce that time and the human and other resource elements and risks to our program and others are the only way we are going to accommodate the needs of market-based programs and begin to make a difference in terms of climate change impacts.
Well said, Debbie. Before we move on from this slide, Mitch, I just would be curious to get your perspective, both as a farmer, but also as someone who runs Continuum Ag, how you might interface with these new technologies that are coming online, ultimately to help farmers make decisions that allow them to have healthier soil health, which you guys have been doing for the last 50 years, and also that you're helping farmers do going forward. How those pieces sort of fit together?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm in a unique spot that with Continuum Ag, we're helping. Our role at Continuum Ag is to help farmers to navigate this space, bring in the data that they need to be able to, optimize their scoring and make sure that the carbon is going to be there, no matter how we're going to measure it and test it and whatnot. I've done pilot projects with nearly all of the companies that have their logos here. I work with a lot of them, on an ongoing basis, and in a unique spot where I've got my own farm to be able to play with, and that's how I bring in all these systems. Like before I take them to my customers, I test them on my own farm first. I'm in a really unique spot to be able to do that. But the main thing that I'm taking away with this is that farmers, I think we need to enable farmers to aggressively implement these programs and stuff, and that a focus on the real outcome, a focus on drawing down carbon, being low carbon intensity, that needs to be the main goal. As you highlighted before, there's lots of different practices that can lead to generating these outcomes. I really think we've got to enable farmers to be paid and be compensated based on the outcome that they generate, not just the practice that they can check a box and do the practice, which incentivizes doing the bare minimum, because the payment isn't enough to really incentivize doing it to the best of your ability. It incentivizes do the bare minimum. So hopefully there's a little bit of money in your pocket at the end of the day, because the cost of doing these things is really expensive. And the cost of cover crops has gone up by about 25% since last year. That's just one of the things.
No, that's a really good point. And I feel like high quality, low cost, high fidelity measurement underlies so much of that, and underlies so much of the trust of a system like that for an outcomes-based system as opposed to a practices-based system.
And the last piece of it being that we're looking here at the soil organic carbon. That's the last piece of the chain of the cycle.
Right.
What we try to help our farmers understand too is the leading indicators. I call it liquid carbon, but it's those exudates that are putting that carbon down into the soil, the biological activity. The majority of soil organic matter and soil organic carbon, it's actually microbial necromass, microbial carcasses.
Yep.
And we can measure that. Those are leading indicators to these kind of things. So I try to bring in that because, if we're going to look at carbon once every 5 or 10 years or so, we need to make sure on an annual basis that we're tracking in the right direction. We try to bring that to our growers too, and do it in a manner where they can pay for it, and it can be directly cost effective.
Awesome. Thanks, Mitch. Moving forward from this measurement component, I want to talk about this sort of in the context of a project and the way in which that might look. The example we're going to talk about is going to be livestock. And so I'll just jump to this next slide here. And just thinking about livestock having significant emissions contributions in the form of enteric fermentation, manure management, and then in some countries, particularly and well publicized in the Amazon, issues with deforestation and land degradation due to increasing land quantities for livestock grazing. And so there's kind of two ways to think about the ways in which livestock production can be decarbonized. One is thinking about how do we functionally allow livestock to improve landscapes through rotational grazing, improve the health of grassland ecosystems. And the second is thinking about, okay, this enteric fermentation thing is an annoying component of ruminant systems. Is there something that we can do to reduce the amount of methane that's being emitted? And that's, people are trying to solve that issue through, in some cases, feed additives like red seaweed as an example. But I want to bring Kevin into the conversation here, given that livestock production has faced so much criticism for its contribution to GHG emissions and general ecosystem degradation. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the work you guys are doing at Vence and how a tool like Vence's can help shift that paradigm? And then beyond that, how a tool like Vence's would participate in the context of some of the carbon programs we've talked about, like ESMCs or others?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So the first thing I want to say is that it is really, really early in understanding how regenerative and rotational grazing affects the land. We know that it has positive effects on things like water and soil water infiltration, biodiversity, and carbon, but exactly how much and how much that varies in different regions is still something we have to work on. There are some programs that are active, and there are some really promising studies across the United States, as well as a peer-reviewed model that's being used for a variety of different carbon offset programs. But we really need more to get to that point where folks are with cropping. And I think that's important to understanding that investing in a livestock-based carbon program is both a research project in some ways and a commercial one. That being said, there's still plenty of benefits for farmers and ranchers interested in enrolling, given the how the implementation of these regenerative ranching programs does help with production benefits. Additionally, a lot of what people talk about with regenerative ranching is beyond cattle rotations, and that's the one that kind of gets the bulk of attention. And there's kind of these lurking variables where people are talking about cattle rotations, when in reality the rancher is doing things like seeding native perennial grasses back into the land and doing really, really specific riparian buffer management and doing things like silvopasture. So really being able to understand what practices a rancher is doing when they talk about improved grazing management and better regenerative ranching, it's crucial. That being said, with Vence, what we really can do is tell you what exactly is going on in the land with the rancher. A rancher can monitor precisely where their cattle are at any given moment. Pre-planned rotations, I think up to 16 collar rotations can be pre-programmed at once. And that's important in two ways for a carbon program. One is just for general reporting and verification. This is a really good tool to cross-reference ecological outcomes, be them in biomass, in soil organic carbon stocks, or again, biodiversity or water metrics, with specifically, what did the rancher do? How did they move their cattle? Where were those cattle when a certain impact happened over time. And, there's also independent verification through the collars that, the movements that were claimed by the program actually occurred. Additionally, in the future, this is going to be really crucial with providing specific agronomic suggestions that can maximize carbon storage potential. Once we know exactly how different movements have led to different ecological outcomes, we can optimize for that. And we can help, ranch agronomists and ranchers alike really plan for carbon storage potential. That's kind of where Vence is playing in this space, both as an MRV partner for programs. We're listed as one in Mexico right now, and also as a project developer, because we really want to help folks get to market. And there's really a dearth of project developers in the carbon space for grazing. And we're confident that with our technology, folks will be able to maximize their carbon storage potential with what they want to do now and achieve their, ranch management goals. But again, there's still a lot of steps to get there. And, folks are taking a lot of different shots on goal. You could see this with the climate smart commodities programs. There's a lot of really different grazing-based programs doing really different kinds of management practices. Like you said, feed additives, there's a couple agroforestry ones, and lots of different improved grazing practices one. So I'm really curious to see what practices and exactly how these different approaches lead to better ecological outcomes. As Mitch said, it's all about, in the end, storing carbon in the soil. It's not about prescriptive practice management.
Yeah, I think that those are all really good points, Kevin. It makes me want to. So, Lars, you guys are doing some work now in rangeland mapping for carbon and also other soil attributes. Kevin made some comments just around some of perhaps the evolving maturity of some of the modeling and understanding of practice change in rangeland. How are you guys experiencing that as a measurement partner in some of these emerging efforts?
Yeah, for one, this is a really fascinating area for us, and I think for a lot of other folks, that there's about as much grass and rangeland in the United States as there is row crop acres, both, of the order of about 200 million acres. And so identifying methods that can improve soil carbon storage in grass and rangeland have a pretty important potential impact, just like they do for row crop. But as you suggested, it is much earlier days in terms of the type of measurements and long-term projects that have been conducted. So we're grateful to be involved in a lot of those different projects and are seeing early things, but it's only been about a year. But at least firsthand, we've been able to see certain things that some of I was completely surprised at in terms of. So at least on the measurements we made, it seems very clear that aggressive overgrazing dramatically reduces soil carbon. And that makes sense because you're reducing the vegetation pretty quickly over time. No vegetation, no carbon accumulation in the soil. One of the things I saw that in terms of comparing nearby grazing plots of ones that have had routine prescribed burns for many decades and ones that had not, there was a pretty significant difference in terms of there was a nearby overgrazed ranch owned by somebody else until it was bought. And it was right next to one that had prescribed burns on and not been overgrazed for about 30 years. And there was about a 2% soil carbon difference between those two. One looked like the soil looked like coffee. The other one looked like it looked like sand that you buy at Home Depot to mix with concrete. It was white or yellow at best. So that was really shocking to me. That all right, so these practices, as evidenced by those kind of anecdotal pieces, can really accumulate over decades. And so we're starting to see some of those. Some of them were surprising me. I didn't realize how important prescribed burning could indeed be. But if you think about back to the traditional plains of the United States, we had probably more bison roaming these areas than we do cows today. So they're a key part of the whole ecosystem. And we probably had pretty routine wildfires, which is why they're plains as opposed to forests, right? That were burning probably each area on average, maybe 5 or so years. And so there's some natural things that we probably just need to relearn that will help us out along the way. But we're certainly having a lot of fun trying to make all these measurements and help folks like, Mitchell and Kevin understand with the data so they can help inform, grazing practices and land management practices in the future.
Yeah. And then thank you, Lars. And then just Debbie, briefly, is this when you guys think about rangeland systems versus cropping systems, is that something that you're focusing both on at ESMC, exploring these new opportunities in rangeland? How are you guys managing two systems that are pretty different in terms of the models that we have and also the amount of historical precedent there is for participation in programs around cropping versus rangeland?
Yeah, we are, our first pilot actually included rangeland in Texas and Oklahoma. And what we found is there is in fact a dearth of data to populate models, right? So it is important that technologies like EarthOptics are actually out there quantifying, because we don't have good baseline data. We don't have good research data to populate the models. So it's very different, you know, as Kevin explained, it's very different from the amount of data that we can draw from within cropland systems.
Yep.
One additional point I'll make though, so we can't populate the models now without the data. So we have to have different analytics and different tools to figure out what's going on. And that over time will populate the models. But we're starting at a much lower bar than what we did in cropland systems. But I do worry that we're focused so much on animals and the enteric methane emissions and manure management. We are forgetting that if we take those animals off the land, we will lose all of the benefits of those grazing lands, which are incredibly important. Kevin pointed to some of it, but just the value of those lands, you can't remove the animals and expect them to remain there and be productive and be sequestering carbon. So we've got to figure out the whole cow and the land-based opportunities.
Well said. Well, we have one more slide here. Mitch has put on his Continuum Ag hat for us today, and now he's going to put his farmer hat on for us. So just to backtrack a little bit, we've covered some of the issues associated with emissions sourcing from agriculture, some of the practices that can be done, a wide variety of practices, either reduce emissions or sequester emissions, the programs that are benefiting farmers in terms of, or they can eventually compensate farmers for these changes in practices and the outcomes, in addition to some of the technologies that are helping us measure those outcomes that they're actually happening. But that being said, there's still, I mean, Mitch, I think you and I, when we talked on the phone, you had the actual specific statistic, but the percentage of farmers who are enrolled in carbon programs in the US is very, very small. And so obviously there's a lot of momentum coming out of some of the USDA grants, et cetera. We need to keep building on that kind of momentum. So even with these opportunities around credits, you know, you could get compensated, soil health, you know, there's sort of an inherent benefit to participating and then potentially selling your products at a premium because they're grown a certain way. Talk to us a little bit about what the main challenge that still remain that keep farmers and producers saying, I don't know, like, is this really going to benefit me? Am I really going to profit from it in the long run? Am I going to be supported? Is it going to be a pain to work with? Talk through some of those issues that you've seen yourself and the farmers in your network.
Yeah, perfect. The main thing in working with these carbon initiatives is the main thing that farmers need is transparency around how do I get paid, what moves the needle, what do I need to do to really optimize the dollars that I'm going to get, and then what's the flexibility going to look like if the value of these things increases. The data you're referring to was put together by Farm Journal. 93% of US farmers are aware of carbon markets, and less than 3% are pursuing and enrolling in one. You know, and I've never been paid for carbon. Now, most of my farmers, you know, are early adopters in this. They don't qualify because of the definition of additionality being a one-time practice change. We need to obviously redefine that for agriculture. Our footprint's gonna be different every year. New farmers come to the table are saying, hey, help me to establish a baseline, help me to start making practice changes, because I see that these regen practices are better. And I fully believe that they are better, and farmers will come to the table because farming in a regenerative system is more profitable. It is more resilient. It is better for the family farm. So they will come eventually. I hope that these programs can be there to enable them to really have success in doing that. But the main thing that I want to leave the group with is that today, you know, we need to be able to quantify the carbon footprint of our farms. And that's really what I'm after. And if anybody can help me do it, I really want to be able to get to that point. And doing projects with a bunch of the groups that we've talked about here. There's a standard today for the carbon footprint of corn that's going into scope 3 reporting. And I know one farmer who's ran his actual numbers, his actual carbon impact or GHG impact per bushel or per acre. That's what I want to get to and show farmers, here's all these data that you're tracking on your farm, which we can help them to do it and make it cost effective, track everything that happens and put a carbon intensity number to it. And show farmers, here's where you're at today. here's the opportunity for you to improve. And as you improve, maybe we can deploy mitigation and offset, mitigation units as they are reducing that supply chain carbon intensity, and ultimately need to get farmers to a carbon neutral or even a carbon negative outcome where, that scope 3 impact can already be carbon negative or carbon neutral, and not necessarily need other avenues to be able to offset that. I believe there we can incentivize those growers that are able to show that data and are able to show that they're already carbon neutral. They can be earning premiums. Those premiums go away with basic supply and demand over time. And we're able to utilize today's market drivers to get this to be paid for, to compensate farmers, to document their carbon impact, to optimize their carbon intensity for their farm using whatever practices are best for them. And we can enable those farmers to understand the pros and cons of changing those practices, the financial impact of those practice changes versus the financial compensation for the carbon intensity outcome. I see a lot of farmers ready. They're ready to come to the table. They know that they're going to have to go this route. The main thing we need is showing transparency within the calculations. We will help them to bring the data to the table to most accurately run those calculations.
It sounds like, the sort of knowledge gap in the agronomy support is a big deal. You mentioned that previously. And then
that was my main takeaway from the climate smart commodity grants is I love paying farmers for practices, but there's a lot of there's money out there, and only 4% of farmers in 2017 anyway, 4% of farmers using cover crops and about 30% using no-till. This stuff is hard, and the knowledge does not exist at the universities. It doesn't exist within USDA, and in the private sector too, or farmer to farmer learning. It's tough to be able to really teach it. I'm really trying to scale that. I definitely don't have all the answers, but really seeing, hey, this stuff can work, but it is nuanced to every single farm, and the understanding of how do I do this, that really is the ultimate gap. And to the point of all this, we're doing these things and making it work, and we're more profitable than we've ever been on our family farm with zero taxpayer federal subsidies, without the need for federal crop insurance, and with no environmental outcome payment. Now, my soil organic carbon's been built up by the rate of up to 4.9 tons of soil organic carbon per acre per year over the last couple of years, and I'm not able to accurately, communicate that into the supply chain. That's what I want to be able to do, but the practices on their own can pay for themselves. We just need to be able to come together and show growers, here's the data that you can help us so we can all meet our goals, and we'll compensate you for the more that you do, and enable that farmer innovation to drive this thing. That's the most important thing in agriculture is farmer innovation, and we need to really leverage that.
Thanks, Mitch. Debbie, I'm curious to know if you have a perspective here on some of the comments that Mitch made around sort of the knowledge gap and helping with the transition, but also the additionality issue and how you guys are thinking about that for finding ways to compensate farmers who've already made transitions that are beneficial.
Yeah, so I think Mitch was dead on in his comments, right, about not only opportunities, but challenges and barriers. And knowledge is truly needed. Farmers and ranchers, right, they don't have a lot of time to play to get a crop into the ground and take on the new practices. So knowledge information is important. Additionality is important for market programs, right? Because you're selling something, it has to be new. It's like selling a corn crop if there's no corn there, right? So additionality is important. However, its interpretation for biological agricultural systems, I think, is being misapplied, and we need to rethink that. A cover crop is costly and new every year, right? So there's some simple fixes that are pragmatic really need to be applied to the lens of agriculture.
Awesome. Thanks, Debbie. Well, I know we're a little bit over time here. If anybody has to drop off, I totally understand. We do have some questions from the audience. And now if you have further questions that haven't already been asked of our speakers, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. I will filter through some of these once I'm done talking, and answer them in the order that they're received. It is very helpful if you can state who you would like to ask your question to, and make sure your question is well articulated. It is hard to read sort of half sentences as questions, and I probably won't read them if they're written as such. But the first question is for Debbie, which is around understanding of the value of a carbon offset versus a carbon inset. There's a statement made, offsets have value as they can be bought and sold. They have market value. How do you establish the value of an inset? The company that makes the change must understand their cost to create an inset versus the cost to buy in an offset. So I guess, does that make sense, Debbie?
It does. And I'll answer this way. Carbon offset markets are global. So you see global price signals and global valuation. It's a little bit different. You see higher prices in Europe, for instance, in the United States, but they tend to be global and you see the pricing. The insets or the supply chain reporting, it is different and individual. What we've done, and I think everyone's handling it differently, is we've just put a price, $15 a ton for carbon, right? And then now we're really experimenting with how do we hit that sweet spot? I talked about how we allow members to co-invest to bring that down and then create dividends for producers. But there's, when we start to see a market program and supply chains for insets, et cetera, come online, we will start to see some of that pricing being more transparent. And I think you will begin to see price discovery happening differently and being reported and more transparent differently than it is now.
Gotcha. Thanks, Debbie.
Yeah, I got a follow-up question, Debbie. With some of the insetting, do you see any ability to utilize the increased dollar value in 45Q to be able to enable some of that 45Q, with the Inflation Reduction Act going from $50 a ton to $85 a ton? Do you think that can enable some of the push towards insetting or can we even, I know today we can't necessarily use scope 3 reporting for that, but do you think that's an opportunity to enable this to go further?
Well, biologicals currently don't count under 45Q, and there was a long shit fight, literally going back 15 years to try to get that in. I don't foresee it being included in the future. It doesn't currently count. So that mechanism, however, could be deployed separately in a different policy, but there isn't currently one like that. I wish, right?
Debbie, another question from the audience. I think it's directed toward you, but open to others as well. Is how do you attribute the scope 3 benefits across multiple parties? And I think you spoke to that a little bit earlier, but maybe just clarifying that.
Yeah, and I'll give you one example to make it a little more concrete. And I will say we don't do this, right? SustainCert has set up a platform that does track this, but I will give you an example. If we are working with a partner, let's say Cargill, that is purchasing beef from one of our livestock projects, and we show an improved emission factor, intensity-based emission factor for that beef. Cargill buys that, they process it, they sell some of it to McDonald's and some of it to Target, right? All of those 3 companies can share in that emission factor because it's the same product that receive that emission factor from improvements in soil carbon and greenhouse gas emission reductions. They can share that as long as it's the same project or product, right? So SustainCert's platform will track that and allocate it as beef goes to one player and the hide goes to another in a way that we can't do. We just create the emission factor for that first product at the point of sale, and then they track it, but we can help with the resale. And I hope that makes sense, but it's a complicated system to really unravel how commodities are actually bought and sold and broken down over the supply chain.
Yep. Thanks, Debbie. Question for anybody on the panel. Based on what happened with the Chicago Climate Exchange in the early 2000s, is a voluntary carbon market a viable model versus a regulated or mandatory model?
I've got opinions on that, but I think the way that we're unfolding the voluntary carbon markets are probably the appropriate way. It's very similar to, I think, the way that the organic markets evolved around a similar time frame in terms of it was kind of the Wild West for a while. You had groups of growers and food companies, either individually or as target groups, creating their own standard for what organic meant to them. And then that went on for almost over a decade. The USDA spent a long and careful time analyzing what was happening, and then slowly and very meticulously rolled out standards for what you had to do to claim something as organic in every single food category. And I think that's what's happening in the voluntary carbon markets, where the USDA is very carefully watching the marketplace unfold, and eventually they'll start probably applying standards, maybe first around quantification requirements and standards to what is a ton, what do you have to do to say this is a ton in some of the various areas. But I think they're years away from that. So I think they're taking the right approach, and I think it'll all work out great in the end.
I think the other thing I would add is that, the Chicago Climate Exchange was an awesome pilot effort to see how, in fact, we include agriculture in a carbon offset market program. It had no additionality, and that is really what created its downfall, is it didn't meet the actual market requirements. It was not because it was voluntary. There was zero additionality. They were signing up farmers to do things they were already doing. And when buyers discovered that, they were like, uh-oh, we paid for something that was going to happen anyway. So that is why additionality as a concept is important. I still disagree with how it's being applied to agriculture.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, yeah, that's interesting in historical context.
Yeah, just one quick add-on right now is, internationally, there's this group called the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets that just released really specific guidance. I've heard folks talk about the ICVCM as being the new law of the land for offsets, and it has really strict additionality policies that don't necessarily align with what's out there with the different standards. So, Debbie talked about the need to really have clear, understanding of what additionality means in agricultural settings. And that's something to really keep an eye on. I really hope that we can develop some sort of probability of practice model. What was the probability that an XYZ year, a farmer would be incented without carbon to do cover cropping or to do rotational grazing and establish that infrastructure? What is that IRR? And that's more of an economics question than an agronomic one in some ways. But I think we really need that for agricultural carbon markets to scale globally.
Thanks, Kevin. I think given where we are from a timing perspective, we're going to wrap things up. So I first and foremost want to thank our panel today, Kevin, Mitchell, Debbie, and Lars. Really appreciate all of your thoughts, input into planning this presentation, but also into all the insights that you shared with us today. They got a lot of comments in the Q&A just saying thank you so much for such an informative discussion. So thank you guys for your input. Thank you to the audience for your thoughtful questions and for your participation today. If you want to view this in a recording, this will be available on YouTube in the next week. I'm also happy to distribute the PDF to anybody who's curious and wants to have either access to the slides or to the links that I got information from for those slides. Otherwise, thank you all so much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next deep dive.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks,
all.
everyone.